as well. Feel free to comment still if you want. Let's see here. I think that what I'll do is actually go to something like office hours for a little while after this webinar, and then any kind of the various threads people want me to address or wrap up, people can come on and talk about it, and we'll do it that way. And then if there's something that in particular I want to cover, then I'll let people know. But otherwise, I'll try doing that for a bit. Great. Thanks, Ryan. And then people can ask me stuff. If they have a business question or want me to look something over, I can generally address that as well. All right. I worked at things for a while today. I pretty much some days I'm able to do this, some days it's less necessary or I'm not able to, but mainly focus on this all day. You'd think that would mean I'd have a whole detailed structure, but it doesn't quite work that way. I mostly spend the day trying to figure out like, the bottom line kind of idea. I first start with my mind gives me just a bunch of scattered details for most of, and without coherence. As those come out, they're all pretty nice and useful details, but a particularly useful takeaway did come together. So I'm glad about that. And so we can go to the slides, I suppose now. And let's see here. Okay. When I talk about takeaways, it's more like I'm explaining, building the case, showing how it varies from how people normally look at things and so forth. But I want to draw a contrast for you guys. And this is the kind of situation that's going to come up all the time and does come up all the time for you. And it's going to give you our mind. I'm not explaining it yet. I'm giving some background. Our minds can and do build complex framework. You have all kinds of memories and knowledge and so forth. And then as we understand that we're not our mind, there's a conscious interaction, right? There's something we're doing consciously that is going to also obviously affect things and steer things. And a lot of the basic question in life comes down to how do you consciously participate in your life? It looks like so much of what your mind does when you say, oh, I think of that, or I thought of this, or I thought of that. It's really your mind coming up with that, right? So a lot of what people tend to think they're doing, their mind is doing, which can also obscure our real power, right? Because whatever our mind is doing is based on its current level, in essence, of understanding and so forth. Our mind and body can put a lot of effort in, and what that'll do is get us results that are still based within the level of our current level of understanding, in a sense, in a deep sense. So there's the critical, important in one sense, deep, that's irrelevant, but important is what's relevant. There's an important central question that we're always trying to address here and understand better, which is what can we do consciously to lift all boats, so to speak? And when I say all boats, all of our kind of thoughts and actions and goals and stuff that our mind comes up with. So like lifting the boats of our mind, right? But the real increase in our results and quality of life and success is going to come from whatever's going to lift all of that, whatever's going to give us a better basis. And that has something to do with what we do consciously. And whatever we do consciously needs to have a certain simplicity to it. Let me give you an illustration that is at least like parallel. It's not like an exactly perfect illustration, but it's a parallel. If we think about Magic: The Gathering as a game, strategy game, right? It's played with collectible cards. It was, as far as I know, was basically the original one prior to Pokemon and a number of others, some for adults. Pokemon was a bit more for kids, but Magic was played mostly by like gamer guys in their 20s, and the original and one of the particularly big ones, of course, probably the biggest. So if we compare that with chess, to me, chess is not really a strategy game. It's a way too simple to really have much resource management, and computers can do it. And chess masters are mostly people that have memorized a massive amount. That's basically what makes you a chess master, is you've developed this massive framework that amounts to memorization of what to do in virtually every situation. So they're not really strategists in the way that I think of it. And I'm not being critical with that. I'm not saying they're lesser or whatever, but it's a different sort of technique. A little bit like if you're a really good tennis player, that doesn't necessarily make you anything to do with a strategist. It means that you've done something analogous to memorization. In this case, some of it's mental, but a lot of it's with your muscles and the way your nerves communicate with your muscles and so forth, and to make you a great tennis player. But you wouldn't call it exactly a strategy game. There might be some room for strategy in it or anything, of course. But with Magic: The Gathering, there's so much complexity and randomness that you can't come anywhere near winning through any kind of memorization or recipe or set of recipes. What you need to do instead is figure out a way to prepare and understand so that while you're playing within a particular hour when you're playing, or at less when you're playing a match against one person, which is best 2 out of 3 games, then you need to have a number of simplifications or heuristics in your mind that, remember, again, you can't possibly memorize it, right? If they try to make a computer to play Magic the Gathering, it's pathetic. It's not even, it doesn't come with a million miles of playing well, unless they dumb down the game itself tremendously, right? With what they're playing with, perhaps they could do decent, but they just can't do it or come anywhere near doing it because you can't do it with a bunch of algorithms and recipes. You instead need to have a certain profound simplicity that to be very good at, that overall governs your playing. And so in that way, it mimics life very well. And in fact, people that were top Magic players tended to do pretty well with whatever else they were doing in life. Because again, it really mimics life in the sense that there's way too much complexity to handle through just learning or memorizing or even hearing from other people recipes, right? Because when you hear from someone else a recipe, like with making money, right? Or whatever it might be, then their circumstances are going to be different than yours in a whole number of ways, right? Their personality, the people they know, their talents, all kinds of stuff. And just their circumstances, the random potential clients that they talk to, all that stuff. Of course, we can get plenty of raw material, right, for them. But one of the reasons why OMG is so vast, right? And we even have, in addition to training and all the recorded webinars, we have ongoing webinars week after week, and we've done so for years, is because it's like this raw material for you, right? In order to really help you succeed. If it can be one quick recipe, then we could just handle that and do it and have a different model, right? For how the whole thing works. So it's the making money overall, and especially in our kind of small entrepreneur niche, is a similar type of thing. But this is going to emerge all over the place in life where there's a way to handle life overall, where there's so much complexity that you can't possibly, I'm not in any way saying that details don't matter. Details might matter tremendously, but there's a certain way that you can't start by projecting details. With chess, like with Magic, I know I'm switching around here, but with Magic, you have a set of understandings. And then you look at particularly what's going on with the game. And because of, if you have the right foundations in our sense, and Mike and I successfully taught people this. And my approach was very much based on giving people these kind of meta strategies that they could then use. It's like a place to stand, in essence, a perspective where they could look at the situations and they would naturally see what to do better. Whereas in chess, the approach is to memorize a whole bunch of stuff so that you actually already have it in your mind and you project it or you overlay it on top of what the situation is. You're not really finding a place to stand. You're more, again, memorizing and therefore projecting what you already have in your head onto the situation. That type of thinking only works if you're lucky or in very structured situations where there's very little room to maneuver, very little stuff outside of your control and outside of what you could at least theoretically memorize. For an amateur at chess, it might seem like a tremendous amount to memorize. But for someone who's really obsessed with it and becomes a master or grandmaster, this is why they can play blindfolded, literally, right? You can, but it's such a good illustration of what I'm saying is that when you memorize, you then project, right? Because it's already in your head. And so you're basically seeing what's already in your head, right? And that's effective in some situations. And that's why a chess grandmaster can literally play multiple people blindfolded because they don't have to see with their eyes. They just have it all in their head and they project it, right? In essence, right? There's a little bit of adjusting to what's going on. Of course, the different players make different moves, but they pretty much have it all there already in their head. So that's why they're able to remember it all because it's easy to seemingly remember a ton of stuff that seems to be happening in the moment when it's already in your head. So if you listen to someone say something familiar in your native language, then it's pretty easy to remember a lot of what they said. If they said it in a foreign language, you don't already have that whole language memorized in your head, right? So if you were to try to memorize the sounds or whatever they were saying, it's like impossible, right? You can't hardly remember one syllable of what they're saying. Remember, it's a stark difference. And actually, if you're reading something where it's like a message, a type of, let's say there's like a default message from Facebook or some program you're using that might even be a paragraph, but it pops up and you've seen it many times before, then you can read and remember what it said or that you saw it, because just in a glance, it's already in your head, right? And so it's triggered. As I continue, you're going to see how that memorization type, recipe type of strategy is used by default by people and by our minds in all sorts of places where it's not appropriate. And instead, you'd be much better off going straight, looking and searching and having a kind of a method and a habit and a method, and be good at finding the right place to stand rather than trying to find directions. Sometimes there's going to be what seems like a blend, but fundamentally, what's going to be really making things work for you is finding a place to stand. And this relates further to the law of attraction, which the law of implication relates to as well, right? Where the beauty or the potential beauty of the law of attraction is its simplicity. That's what people like about it, right? Then the question is, does it work and how does it work? But the idea of it is attractive and we hope it works because it allows us to do something that's fundamentally simple, which is to focus our thoughts or focus on something, right? And I talk about priorities, right? How I'll mostly look to accomplish something by finding a way through a combination of revealing and even waiting to clear some things out or doing stuff to clear other priorities out and so forth. And a combination of immersion where the totality of it makes it a priority, right? And figuring out boundaries so that it can remain a priority or not be a priority at the wrong times. But if you focus there, there's a certain simplicity and profoundness to that. And then that pretty much takes care of accomplishing what you want to accomplish. Of course, that means you're going to be noticing all kinds of details. You're going to be accessing your memory. You might be asking people how they do this, that, or the other thing, but at the right time in the right place. And you'll generally see it properly when someone gives you a recipe. You'll be able to utilize it in the right way and adjust it fairly well, at least over time. You might first try exactly what they say and then need to make adjustments overall as you continue with building your framework and whatever it is that you're trying to succeed at. But you start with the profound simplicity of making it a priority and making sure that rock that you're standing on is a rock in the first, that the priority isn't wavering and blurry or even not a priority at all. And then you fundamentally focus there and that leads to your success. So it's that type of thinking and I thought of, in essence, both this core idea, of course, it's related to everything else I've talked about, but it's a great angle and then way to expand on it. And that's like your takeaway for today. That's what I'll be talking about. And of course, it's similar to what I've always been talking about in a good way, but I think there'll be a new clarity from me expressing it in this way. The illustration I used last webinar was quite poignant about how if you were in the middle of the woods and trying to figure out how to get to a town that you wanted to get to, but you weren't sure how to get there and you were trying to go by feel, or I think it's this way, or I think this is the way I came, and then whatever, then that's one thing. But then if you were to be able to get into a helicopter or something and just see where the town was directly, then it would remove a number of things, right? It would remove competing goals, so to speak, of it wouldn't matter whether you felt like you should walk in one direction or another at that point. You obviously just see where the town is and what direction to go, and you would just go in that direction. If you got back out of the helicopter for some reason, we're back on your feet. Or if you just had a GPS, right, and that was reliable. And once you put directions in there, then put your destination in there, then you no longer would really be checking what you had otherwise memorized, some other recipe or map. If the GPS was definitely reliable, you would just follow it and not consult other sources or worry about what other things you had memorized or other potential recipes or feelings you might have. You see what I mean? Are details important in that situation? Sure, but it's almost like an irrelevant question, right? The details become clear as they need to, and you don't need to look at, and also which details are irrelevant. The details of how you feel like based on which way you walked from, right? Where you're trying to think how that's related to where you should go to get to the town. That detail is irrelevant now because you have a GPS. The looking in front of your face and not banging into a tree is obviously relevant, but that's clear, right? And stuff like that. So what I'm saying here has nothing to do with, it's not really big picture versus details. It has to do with whether you attend to the overall box or rock or foundation or perspective that you're standing on that frames the issue, or whether you don't really pay attention, similar to how someone might not really pay attention to what their priorities are, including what factors will come up that influence those priorities, right? Such as various interruptions or things like that, or things that add a vagueness to their sense of priority that confuses someone when choices come up and things like that. When your priorities are clear and in boundaries, then choices tend to become easy. You don't have to think, what did I decide last time there was a similar situation? Right? That's like recipe based thinking, template based thinking, memorization based thinking. Using your memory and templates is perfectly fine, but it's secondary is my point, and it's fully secondary. Meaning that, of course, if you have a GPS, you have your eyes open and you pay attention to what your eyes tell you, but in terms of finding the town, it's secondary to what your GPS is telling you in terms of overall direction and so forth. Do you hear? And often there's predictable times in life, such as with what you feel like doing day by day, or what you feel like is, I don't just mean purely feel like doing based on pleasure, but even feel like doing based on like stuff for work that feels productive to you. That is notoriously unreliable, right? So there's a number of areas in life, or our feelings about whether a person is trustworthy, they're going to be a good business partner or any kind of relationship partner, right? Those are notoriously unreliable. We might believe that we're a good judge of character, but we're really biased about, generally speaking, right? So our own self-assessment about how well we can judge and size people up is typically, again, biased in the first place. So and it's pretty unrealistic, right? To be able to really judge people well based on a little bit of information. There's an illustration with politics that'll stick in your memory. It's fairly poignant and true, but I'm only trying to illustrate this concept. Again, I'm not trying to make a point about political parties. I'll just leave political parties out. Let's suppose you had a country where there's two political parties and it's structured a lot like America, where realistically, when people get into, say, Congress, they're going to just block vote with their side, right? In America, that's massively overwhelmingly how it is, right? Even in the Supreme Court, the justices just block vote with their political ideology. And it's amazing because they have these, it's almost like for show, right? Like it's shocking. They have these court cases, they treat it very seriously, they wear all these formal things. They have this whole methodology they tout for how they do things so that they don't bias each other and influence each other, blah, blah, blah. And all they ever do is block vote 100% in their political audio, right? And they have these hearings in the Senate, blah, 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 and nothing but down the line block voting. So you have something where, and then you have these elections and a lot of people, not everyone, not even the majority, but there's plenty of people who, and my mom was expressed this sentiment, where it's I vote for the person, not the party. That's an exact illustration of the opposite of what I'm talking about here. That's exactly wrong because that's where you're not looking at the box or the foundation. You're looking at the details and how things seem. And it's the same thing about picking various partners for business or any kind of relationships. It's notoriously people are going to put on a face and look good for a while and so on and so right. Or you get a romantic relationship and you're euphoric and it seems particularly great and the person seems better than you've ever seen before and you project all sorts of stuff, right, on them. And so but it's weirdly counterintuitive for people. I can easily imagine someone having a conversation with a friend after they get in a relationship they're like, oh, what should I do? And the friend is, you got to trust your heart and trust your instincts. And what did you think of the person based on the first two dates and things like that? And that's, again, an exact illustration of the wrong way to go about it, according to what I'm saying. That stuff like that is very seductive. But going to the politics illustration to poignantly or memorably illustrate what I'm saying, despite flaws with both the people and the parties, if one is practically much better than the other in terms of the practical result that you can expect about what's important, then literally the presidential candidates that I voted for, they could have been on video performing a satanic ritual, killing their children with blood dripping down with their mouth, like with their jaws and blood dripping their chin. And I literally would have absolutely voted for that person. No question. If it was the political party that and if you look at the practical effect on the country, I'd be right by far. We see it with Trump. If you generally like conservative or Republican policies versus liberal Democratic policies, or vice versa, if you hate them, right? Then Trump's supposed character, one way or the other, while it's just tried to be made a massive issue, is utterly irrelevant, right? In terms of actual policies, then it's pretty stark, right? Like it's just pretty much down the line in a certain way, right? So the details like that don't matter. And it doesn't really matter. And so again, I'm not making a political point. I'm trying to just give a bunch of, at this point, I'm not even trying to quite convince you yet. I'm mostly trying to illustrate what I'm talking about, what I'm saying. When it comes to sales, this will kind of tie together something I've said various times about sales, where it's going to tend to be more effective and more doable to really want to buy what you're selling, right? And to generally be standing in a place. And there's even more than that potentially, right? What I've talked about, if you know how you're going to fulfill, the more clarity you have on fulfillment, right? Things like that are like a place to stand. That is where you're naturally going to tend to see um, in the moment, rather than trying to get ready to project in the moment based on memorizing scripts and other various recipes, but where you're not so much feeling that you want to buy what you're selling, or you're not really prepared, but you try to memorize things. Or with my webinars, I mainly focus on getting my ideas straight. I don't have the webinar all written out typically, right? Or anything close to that, or even too much of a structure. Ideally, you would do both, but in real life, there's no such thing. That's where the Magic the Gathering card game illustration comes up. You have an hour total for a match, and you don't have that much time for each turn. And so it's not realistic to think every thought you could possibly think in the moment, right? What's the trouble with having too much of a memorized sales presentation is you're not seeing the other person and their circumstance very well. Now, the more of a framework of distinctions you have built up in your mind, the more experience you have done in the right way, then that gives you more distinction. Distinctions are helpful. They can help you see, right? That's why I talk about understanding. Is what you want overall is whatever's going to help you see better, rather than you're not trying to approach life like a chess grandmaster where you have it all memorized. Now, of course, overall, you might say, yeah, I know that, David. I'm not going to try to have everything memorized. But again, there's all kinds of ways that people act implicitly as if that's what they're trying to do. Whenever we're trying to prove that we're already smart or good at something, or our confidence, another way to put it is, where's your confidence coming? Now, because of our time together and everything you've learned and so forth, and the progress people have made, then very possibly a lot of your confidence is coming from the right place, which is good. But I'm just giving you another angle on why that's correct. If your confidence is coming from the default place of, because I've already succeeded at this a bunch of times, because I'm awesome, people have said yes in the past, right? Trying to stay within your small box that you've mastered, right? That you've chess grandmaster, where you memorized how to do everything, which you can only do if you stay very small, right, in your life typically. And you can deal with other people that way. And I'll point this out so you can see both how it's effective and then the limits of its effectiveness, but why people can appear to be effective at times doing somewhat of the opposite of this. When it comes to both sales and managing people, the other way to do it is to successful guy at marketing and sales remarked to me fairly recently within the last few months, because I'm such a student, he says, of human behavior. I know so much about human behavior. And so in a sense, what he meant though, this is not about him, but about explaining to you, is that again, it's like being a chess grandmaster, where there's a way of managing people where you don't really understand them or yourself or the mind, right, very well, which is the opposite of the way that I go about doing things, and the opposite of my basic that I'm talking about here and that I use so throughout my life. But it can look effective, and it is, as long as you stay within that box, and as long as people get in that box and stay in it with you, right? So in there's circumstances such as with sales, marketing, or with managing people, where if you create a very rigid circumstances, like in a particular, a corporation could be structured this way, right? Or even a small business, even a marriage or a one-on-one relationship where someone stays within boundaries and doesn't, often these people will to get very agitated at someone if they question like the box, right? If they ask certain questions or if they're defiant in a certain way according to that person or whatever, however it might manifest itself. And people will often get in relationships with these people where they feel that anger will come and they stay away from it. Analogous to how with our own minds, people stay away from like getting outside the box or questioning their deep core beliefs and epistemology about the world and so forth, because they feel that sense of like repulsion, or might be like where it's going to get bad if I go over there, that kind of vague threat, right? So people have that with their own minds, with their own understanding of the world and themselves and who they are. And then people have that in relationships with various people where we're careful not to push certain boundaries and stay within a box that they're comfortable in. And inside of that, they think of people, you can't do that and think of people as beings, right? Or really as conscious actors very much. You mostly think of them as like objects. And you glom on, and these people that kind of glom on, it's actually normally how people think about people is they fundamentally think of people as objects with like consciousness stuck on there, but in kind of a way that I could delve into that. I'll leave it at that for now. But in essence, there's a way, and this could be more or less extreme. In the extreme, someone like an actual psychopath can be very good at manipulating people because they full on treat people as objects, which encourages other people to stay in a box and act like objects functionally, right? Where they don't question the box. In essence, like an object follows physics, right? It doesn't question the rules that it's operating by. And so they'll elicit, like people themselves, you can look at yourself more like an object or more like a conscious being, right? And for all of us, feeling like an object is worthwhile and relaxing at times, just like flow, getting into something, driving a car, whatever, that I've used different illustrations. There's nothing wrong with just relaxing and mostly not thinking about your deep beliefs and boxes and identity all the time. But you want to get your outer boxes right in order to do that safely and effectively. Anyhow, so there is a way to deal with people that's like very different than the way that I do. And it's effective, but much like I say, the success that people have outside of the law of implication, whole idea that we're talking about here, is based on the problems with their outer frames and boxes not mattering for whatever reason. Basically what it comes down to. And by logic, the opposite of law of implication type thinking is to just assume that your outer frames and foundations and boxes are obviously, it's just simply the exact opposite. And that's how people constantly operate. And therefore, the only way they could, since they're assuming they're correct, and since they got set up based on a methodology of filtering that they were born with when, they're 0 and 1 year old, then it's by luck that they're succeeding regarding their outer frames. They might be putting in all kinds of effort and non-luck based stuff inside the box, but they're absolutely depending on their boxes. We know they're not correct, but they might be functionally useful, or the flaws in their frames might not be relevant for the particular success that they're having. Overall, someone's not going to be fundamentally happy and successful in various areas of their life without getting their boxes straight. At some point, it's going to be a problem. Often people handle that in a circular way by just redefining their standards as the right standards. Okay. So whether it is a new relationship, whether you're trying to get someone to just do a particular project with you, or you're trying to accomplish any goal, you're trying to sell something, in every case, you want to start to notice. And of course, you were doing this to some degree already correctly, right? Of course, especially if we've been together. Most people on this webinar have been together for with me and with this stuff. But I think that there was probably a number of exceptions as well. And I think that this will give you significant additional clarity as you look for it. I remember sales training I got when I was around 20, before I did some door-to-door selling with Southwestern company that they have college kids in the summer sell these study guide books, or they had them do that. And I remember just this kind of tidbit from the training where there was this story about this guy who was like a millionaire salesperson. And people asked him, wow, I'd love to see what script you use. You're selling all this insurance, you're doing so well. And then the other insurance agents in the company didn't do as well, wanted to know the script. And then what the millionaire salesperson said was, I used the script they give us. Like I used the prepared script. And the takeaway from that was supposed to be that, look, just stick to the script. You don't need to reinvent something else. Just use the sales script. And so that would seem to be saying that you just need to stick to the recipe. You don't need something else now or some other technique. But what's interesting is if we look at the story and implicit within the story, and obviously the same thing with the selling that I actually did, is that it's not true. Like people did stick to the script and people had massively different results. So from that, we can tell that obviously the script is not going to guarantee your success. Now, it might be totally reasonable. And as a matter of fact, I would recommend, sure, use their script first, right? Try that. But regardless, what it really shows is in essence, it's irrelevant. It's not going to guarantee your success. And I like to win before I attack, right? I like to figure out how to guarantee success. And once you look at it that way, there's a structure to winning, right? You set yourself up to where there aren't failure conditions. There's just, in essence, feedback conditions or whatever, where either plan A works ideally, or you're going to gain understanding and distinctions, right? And so forth. Was I thinking here? Sorry, I had a thought and then it popped out of my mind. Oh, with mindset is often a bit of more of an outer frame than just following an obviously direct recipe like a sales script or something like that. So that's when people would conclude that mindset is the real key, right? Or Tony Robbins would say, and whenever I reference Tony, I have respect for Tony. I'm not using him right or wrong way. He says some useful things, but doesn't tend to go where I go. So there's something useful about what he says, but then I can also look at it in perspective in various directions. But Tony, of course, talks about how you can have the feeling of unstoppable confidence and you can access it when you want through various triggers and posture and such. And then that will help you, right? And that is an example of a more outer frame helping you to see better, right? Instead of memorizing the tone of voice that you should try to use in a sales presentation, instead you try to first feel a mindset of confidence and then the tone of voice will follow what we might say naturally, right? So that would be an illustration of what I'm saying. However, the confidence itself, accessing it purely through triggers and visualization is violating its own rule of like foundational frame. You see, you're trying to project confidence. There's even a phrase, project confidence, right? Instead, what you guys should do is to stand in a place, have the foundation, which of course we've covered from various angles, but this helps to further illustrate it, or help you understand it, is you want to stand in a place where then when you open your eyes, so it's metaphorically speaking, confidence rather than not confidence, or you act and feel and sound confident. To put it briefly, right? The basic structure of winning will then allow you to experience and feel and see yourself being confident in a way that's assured. It's a kind of astonishing truth that winning has a structure, right? It's funny. Or success, like assured, definite success has a structure. There's such a thing as plans that can't fail. And they have a weirdly simple structure that people generally don't realize, right? Which is, as I said, it's the understanding line, the idea that plan A either hits over the threshold, or you then reassess based on whatever greater understanding that you can gain. And the feedback and experience itself does not give you understanding if it's blocked. And that's an important thing. This is what I'm saying is different than learning mistake. Understanding, as I said before, is blocked by the overall paradigm, right? You don't see understanding. It's obscured when you're standing from a perspective of wanting to believe that your foundation and frames and you, as people think of it, are already correct, are already pretty awesome, or at least are pretty good. People can acknowledge they're flawed, but there's a way that there's all kinds of limits, right? Which when there's limits that are arbitrary, and when I say limits, I mean, there's all sorts of inherent limits that people have on how flawed they want to feel like they already are, right? they can admit that they're a little bit flawed. If you're, say, a pastor that's talking and I'm a sinner too, right? That's one thing. But if you were to say, maybe you're an evil bastard, then that would probably cross his lines, right? You know what I'm saying? Maybe you're the same as a child molester, like on par with them morally because of your feelings about extortion or action, basically. Then maybe you're on par with a serial child molester. That would probably cross their lines. It's not possible for, and I don't have to be a pastor, it could be any person. So with me, this also helps me to further say what I mean about ruthlessness. With ruthlessness, as I talk about, has nothing, of course, to do with treading on somebody else or stepping on someone else or beating somebody else. It has to do with not having arbitrary limit. I want to find what limit should need or should be that is identical, logically identical, need or should in this case. So correct limit that are relevant, necessary, helpful are good, but then I don't have arbitrary ones, including with how correct and not rat bastard-ish that I was, right? However much of a horrific, evil person I might be or was, it's all on the table in terms of me seeking understanding. I think I think it was before even alchemy. I think it was in one of my very original core, maybe I called it core law of implication thing back in like 2013. But I put it in a way where I said, there's going to be a block where you need to be able to address the question. For example, maybe I'm just a horribly evil person. If you're not able to ask that, then there's a way that you can't get where you need to go. I'm not saying someone's evil or not. It's not the issue. The issue is if you don't have the ruthlessness, if you are going to start with arbitrary boundaries and limits, then you're standing on a place where your failure is predictable. The only way you're not going to fail is by luck, which is not a good plan. It's only through absolute ruthlessness that failure is not based on luck. In other words, it's only through making sure that your outer frames. And you see, the nature of reality is such that while we can't get the details, we're not omniscient regarding all the details. Of course, you can get certain individual details, like you can spell an email, all the words in an email, but you can't know every detail that exists, of course. But there's outer frames, many of which we've covered, that you can know, including what I'm saying here, this takeaway in this webinar. You can know that focusing on standing in the right place, so to speak, having the right perspective, and then seeing what from there is where you want to exercise control in your life. It's where you want to focus your power because you can actually do that perfectly and correctly. What you can't do perfectly and correctly is to try to have every detail right in your mind so that you then see it when you look, such as before a sales presentation or before doing a webinar like this. If I had everything right ahead of time, every detail, and then just projected it onto the webinar, and it's using kind of terminology I'm using, that is not doable. It's neither realistic nor effective. And yet what I can do is find core idea that's correct and contrary to what people normally think, right, by default. And I can have that ready for you prior to the webinar. And I can have that. I can't assure that I have that. If I don't have it and I have to have it within one day or something, I can't assure that. But I can get it. And of course, I've done it several times over and over. And if I have it ready for a particular webinar, if I didn't have it ready when I announced the webinar, then that's a bit of luck. Of course, combined with focus and all that. But getting it in the first place, it's attainable. And so I attained it. And whereas I didn't have this exact clarity before today, I worked on it all day to get here. Of course, I overall had a whole bunch of ideas that were worthwhile to share with you guys. They were foundational and correct before beginning this series. And so it's constantly that way. There's the story of when I was in that gifted and talented teachers. So the teachers are not gifted and talented. They're teaching students that are labeled gifted and talented, which basically means their parents are active in the school system. But whatever it might be, the kids are labeled gifted and talented, and the teachers of those students, who are pretty, as teachers go, pretty nifty people, right? And so they have a conference each year, such as in North Carolina. They have one for the North Carolina teachers. I don't know what other states do. I'm sure they do. presumably. And California, sorry, North Carolina is also what's it called, a right to work state. So they're not unionized. That also tends to up the quality somewhat. You had a bunch of great, as teachers go, great teachers there. And I was invited, I was a speaker in one of the breakout rooms. I wasn't a teacher speaker, right? Based on my accelerated learning course that I did. And one of the women who was the most, technically speaking, the most highly respected woman, the teacher, at least of gifted and talented in her district, her son had he went to UVA and took my course. And so through him, I met her. And through her, I was invited to speak here. And then on the last day, the kind of featured speaker who's speaking to everyone at the same time in the big room, about 300 people. And she told about, a lot of you might have heard this story briefly, but it's an illustration of this distinction for the takeaway for today, which I hadn't presented in that light before. And so this speaker was a PhD in education. And she was talking about a colleague of hers who's also a PhD. And she said her colleague got interested in why some people who went to like seminars or also just students in school, some of them would learn from a teacher and some wouldn't. And they're trying to figure out what's the difference. Why do some students learn or some attendees learn better than others? What were the factors? And partly what could teachers do differently, of course, to make students learn better? So there's a few interesting things. One is that, this woman got to be a PhD in education, her colleague. Apparently no one knew the answer because she got a grant to research, right? What's the most important factor or factors and why some students learn better from a particular teacher than others, right? And presumably the answer wasn't just their IQ or something like that. The speaker was telling the story and about her colleague. And then she said that the colleague got a grant and did the research. And then she said, do you know what my colleague found about what was the main factor? And there's a bunch of potential things. One could be intelligence. One could be learning styles, right? Kinesthetic, visual, auditory, who knows? One could be maybe they use more field trips, right? Or do more activities or whatever. But so she asked and she actually paused and really actually wanted to hear what people had to volunteer about what they thought she might have found, but no one answered. And so after several seconds where it was clear that it wasn't a rhetorical question and giving some other people a chance to answer, but they didn't, I indicated that I would give an answer. And I said it would be whether the students like the teacher or the attendees like the speaker. And she looked a bit surprised and she said, you're exactly right. Now that's interesting. I hadn't memorized that, but what I did was I built an understanding of learning. I didn't have to do the experiment either, interestingly. I also knew it wasn't even exactly the right answer. It was more like what a scientist would find to be the right answer, would observe to be the right answer. But I had developed an understanding, meaning a place to stand, a rock, and I just looked at the question and I had the answer. So it wasn't what I'd learned or memorized. It was and of course I had a basic understanding of learning, which is natural to me. If I'm doing something, that's what I do is I build my outer frames. I try to understand it, right? As opposed to just memorize stuff and associate, right? Recipes are associated. The pattern of how the mind works, right? Like the way a car drives as opposed to steering it and so forth. Again, not bad, but should be harnessed in a metaphorical sense, steered. But the mind works by association. Learning works by association. Memorization is association. Memorization is not built off of a correct frame like a tree. When someone memorizes something in school or anywhere, it's generally built from the outside in or from the observations or the surface is where it starts to be built, what you're learning. You get like details, and then the mind basically imposes a structure on those details. What that means is the mind fabricates a frame as a sort of, this might be hitting some people now, violently, right? Again, we learn, and I don't just mean learn in school, we work with the world in such a way that we're constructing, or our mind is constructing what it calls an understanding, but it's not an understanding. It's like a memorization or a construct or whatever of the world or of a particular topic or situation or person. And what it does is it has a bunch of inputs, right? That are surface level inputs, of course, interactions with a particular person that you're learning about, getting to know, right? Doing SEO and seeing what works, right? Or learning from someone, whatever it might be. Trying to do sales presentations and you observe what worked, your mind, right? And so you get details, and then your mind tries to organize those details and provide a structure to it. And it's all associative, meaning it's associative is not built from a foundation upward in a way that is ultimately accurate. When you build something properly from a foundation, such as like libertarianism, as I describe it, is built from one principle, which is individual property rights and no others. Conservatism, by contrast, is a sort of a hodgepodge of observations of that work, and it's a hodgepodge of a reaction to not wanting the British tyranny, right? Conservatism in America only, which is very different than other places. It's a hodgepodge, but I'm using this to just illustrate the difference between an outside-in built hodgepodge versus something built from one foundation up, that's not learned or memorized like the libertarian idea of property rights. And then you apply that to various situations, you think about it and so forth, but it has one root, built. But it's not built. You can use the word built in either process, but I'm not thinking of a good word for describing the building as opposed to what happens with the hodgepodge. But conservatism is built outside in the way people normally think, which is it's a bunch of observations about what will hopefully not cause the same tyranny they had in Britain, a little bit pulled from Plato and his Republic and so forth. And I'm just going by my knowledge. I have full knowledge of the situation, but also Protestant assumptions, ethics, right, and so forth. And it begins actually with a foundation of tyranny and revelation, like from the Bible, the idea, neither of which is foundational. And it tries to do the best it can within that. And it does a pretty admirable job within its bad assumptions. And then a lot of the conclusions of conservatism are fairly useful and constructive and work. Then you have American progressivism is pretty much a rejection of conservatism. And so it really relies on conservatism getting it wrong in order for progressivism to be right. And then it's also a bit of a hodgepodge of useful idiocy from people who want power, right? So you get both because they hijack that teenage movement feeling of rejection, rebellion against conservatism, right? And conservatism is imperfect in a number of ways and tyrannical in various ways. And so it's like parents who are fairly good, but ultimately imperfect. And then the kids rebelling and making a whole bunch of decisions that are far worse, right? And then having those kids get taken in by a cult leader who wants to further take advantage of it, right? That's American progressivism and has a few ideas that happen to be right, a little bit like a clock being right or a broken clock, stuck clock being right twice a day or something. But then otherwise it's a mixture and practice of ideas that further tyranny, right? Also like from Hegel and so forth, who was further tyranny in Germany, right? And so he was propped up by the powers that be there. And so again, basically rebellion and also people being hijacked to further tyranny, like with climate change, where it's all like, regardless of what's correct or incorrect about climate change, every conclusion seems to be the government needs to have more regulation and money and taxes, right? So an odd conclusion that just has nothing to do with climate change, right? To have more tyranny isn't necessarily a disconnect. But that's the danger when you build something by outside in, which is normal. That's how the brain works by default. But conservatism, it's really a bunch of fairly solid sources and people with good intentions, right? Like the framers of the American Constitution, on average, historically, in terms of creating a government, they're pretty wonderful, right? Relative to other much worse tyrannies and governments around the world. But when you use the wrong method, then you still end up with something that is both flawed and it's vulnerable to attack. And you could say, well, David, what about Protestantism? Aren't you a Christian? Isn't that a good foundation? Yet Jesus is great foundation, but Protestantism, while practically speaking, one of the better man-made religions, is a bunch of man-made stuff around Jesus as well as following Jesus, right? It's a combination of both. And so you get both. And some of it seems to work, like having children be more disciplined and obedient to their parents, seems like it works. You don't see the invisible. The problems with that are very invisible. And you have to follow a logical sequence to realize what the errors and why that doesn't work. It seems to work because it works in the moment and it works. It seems to produce better citizens and so forth. Right. What it does when you have children who believe in an arbitrary authority is you have that malleability is how useful it is relevant to the authority, right? So what you have is people who are less able to not obey at the wrong time, right? Which is problematic when it's wrong. It's the problem with any recipe, right? A recipe is great as long as it applies, as long as it works. And then, but if a recipe is reinforced, see, when you use a box, a recipe reinforces the assumptions inherent within the recipe, right? Like to follow any recipe, you have to assume things about the world in advance and then go do the recipe. You use a frame, it reinforces the frame, right? And so you're reinforcing both the whatever's good about the frame, you're reinforcing whatever's bad, the frame you're reinforcing, right? The frame of be generally obedient of the government, right? Which is a conservative idea. The progressive idea is we should have more tyranny, a weird thing. They don't come out and say obey the government. They come out and want more government regulation. So they actually want more tyranny without stressing the obedience. So it's a good way to fool people once again. But although with conservatives, and none of this is a political commentary. It's not very secondary. This is only to think about recipes and ideas and rocks. And I mean that. I'm not kidding when I say that. But as a political commentary, it's fairly relevant, right? And even that can get in the way of what I'm trying to say. But it's a little bit of a shared thing that we're all somewhat aware of that I could talk about just in terms of illustrating. And also the dangers, again, of the recipe-based thinking, right? Conservatives will say free market capitalism is a great system. It produces more. Well, okay, but calling freedom a system is really insidious. It's incredibly bad to call freedom a system, right? Because like then people can reject it as a system and so forth. Like not killing my mother, like not killing our parents is not a system. If we say that Americans don't kick puppies and we call that we name that as a system, and then people say there's problems with America, therefore we should kick puppies. Then you're basically a liberal that don't kick puppies, but they'll say let's reject capitalism as a system. Capitalism isn't a system. Capitalism, free markets is not a non-system. It's merely if a 12-year-old does babysitting, 12-year-old girl babysits, and then she gets paid $20. They're not following a system of either a free market. They're just operating freely, right? The girl and the people. Again, to call it a system is very misleading. And then if the girl wants to prepare to be a better babysitter and have various toys that she brings to further how much she can charge, and that she doesn't have the money for that, and she borrows the money from her parents, that's capitalism. Capitalism merely means borrowing capital, basically, literally. Once again, it's not a system. It's simply a free choice that people can engage in with each other. So to say that it's greedy or it can be runaway or whatever, there's no such thing as like runaway freedom. There's no such thing. There's such a thing as violating other people. Again, my understanding of the world is coherent. It doesn't have all these problems. It's simple, profound, and correct. Right. But yeah, like the conservative argument that comes up sometimes that, again, like based on these observations that, well, free markets have lifted more people out of poverty. Capitalism has had more of a positive effect. That leaves you open for refutation, right? You don't argue that having less leads to women making more money or being more successful. Right. If I argued that, you would look at me funny, probably. I was like, oh, we shouldn't rape women because women that are not raped become more successful. You'd say, well, why? Because then there's people come up with statistics for anything. Can you imagine them arguing against? No, look, in this country, we have rape and the women do this, that, and the other thing. You come up, the reason not to rape women is obviously a violation of individual property rights. That's coherent, foundational. Right? It's not because they're more successful if you don't rape them. Same thing with not violating people economically. has nothing to do with, oh, they'll make more money that way, or they'll be more successful. As a whole, the country will be better economically. It's just evil and wrong for a clear reason because of the individual property rights. So that's also just is eye opening how the typical method of outside in thinking, where or inside, you can call it either way, but as long as you call one way and one the other way, but where people make observations and that's their foundation, that's their basis for things in practice, and that's how conservatism got built, is through observations that it can't defend itself properly because it's not built on a rock. And interestingly enough, it reinforces itself in people's minds that even when they look at libertarianism, of course, plenty of people, when libertarianism is expressed properly, people will adopt it. Some conservatives will adopt it, but some won't. And the famous hosts, Mark Levin and Rush and so forth, they don't have much admiration at all for libertarianism in essence. So when you start building something the wrong way, it can be scary, right? And then you couple that with not wanting to look at shaky foundations because they're shaky, and then you never go there. And then the simplest thought that extortion is evil doesn't occur to the likes of Mark Levin or Rush Limbaugh or whoever, presumably Hannity and so forth, which is odd, right? That's a fairly simple thought coupled with, does the government have a moral magic wand to wave and make something okay? No one really believes that in practice. People don't think the government can make rape okay. Or there was a question about, and I presume, I know that when you guys bring this up to acquaintances, what they'll say, or friends, whatever, about libertarianism, they'll say, how are we going to do such and such? But notice that question wouldn't get asked if I were to say, let's fund the government some other way. Let's harvest organs of young children and sell them. And then someone were to say, I don't think we should harvest organs of young children. And I would say, how else are we going to pay for healthcare? I guess they could say taxation. I could say the exact thing in reverse. They say, how can we pay for roads without taxation? I could take and harvest organs of children. We could enslave people and make people pay to have sex with them. We could just enslave them, make them build roads directly, right? I'm not suggesting those things, of course, but what makes any of those things worse than extortion, right? It's simply not. Imagine an adolescent guy, a guy who's 20, and say you have a particularly unattractive man who's 20, and he rapes some woman, and he were to say, how else was I going to have sex with a hot woman, right? It's just not a relevant response to an evil violating action. Is to say, how else was I going to accomplish this goal that I want? It's just, and yet what's fascinating is that it's so universal that it feels like a relevant question. It feels like a good, valid question to people. How else are we going to prevent Canada from invading, or how else are we going to defend our country? They say, well, first of all, defend from whom? But that's, of course, an irrelevant question anyway. It doesn't matter who you're defending from. It doesn't matter what you want. You don't get it by violating someone else as an individual with their property. If you want it, find a way that doesn't violate it, right? Anything in life, you find a way to get it without violating someone's property in order to get it. That's whatever it may be. Not that hard. At least it's not a hard concept. But all of these things continue to illustrate people are looking, they have these things memorized, right? They're projecting, they're like, how are we going to build roads? They don't think about, what's my foundation? Where do I stand? And when you show them where this is illustrated by when you show them where to stand, right? The idea of individual property rights is clearly correct to someone who thinks without having a mental block. When you show them, they still don't see it, which means that they're not looking for it. They're projecting instead, right? People, when you memorize, you're not looking, you're projecting. I'm not talking about whether or not you should access your memory. Don't worry about that. Well, you don't have to wonder whether to access your memory or use things you remembered. What you do is proactively look for the rock, look for the foundation. So with learning, I talked about one somewhat humorous, but example of the first thing is people should like the teacher or want to be like the teacher in the topic they're teaching about, and things like that. Right. And you can build from there. Presumably they should want to learn the actual thing, but that's why this would say they should want to be like it. Students will learn best when they want to be like the teacher in the area that they teach. Then the rest will flow pretty easily. Learning, everyone has an easy time learning. It's just a matter of whether they're blocked or not. So in practice, people have a difficult time learning many times. But what I mean is only blocks prevent learning. You don't need to proactively do really anything to learn. Brains are terrific at learning. It's a matter of whether it's blocked. With sales, you think about where to stand. You can see with mindset, It's an intermediate frame where it'll make things within its frame better if your mindset's good, or make things within its frame worse if your mindset unhelpful, right? But in and of itself, mindset is not foundational. And so what you want to do is have a place to stand where the right mindset naturally comes. The one of the real deep foundational places to stand that changes people very quickly, and a lot of you or all of you have experienced it, which is what I say about winning, right? And I point out how is it a win if someone imagines that they have one life on earth and they die and people are still suffering? How could they say, as long as people are better off because I live, right? That's a loss, right? Because otherwise you have to say, my goal is this situation, and it includes all these people suffering. So it's like you have a goal for people to suffer. You might say, I want people to suffer less, but less than what? That's arbitrary. That makes no sense, right? If you want people to suffer less, then you want them to suffer less until it goes to zero, right? That's your ideal. And that's the win. Not the how can anything else be called a win? And then that's eye opening. And that's a tremendous place to stand in life. It puts everything else in perspective, as we would say. But what does it mean to put things in perspective? It means that when you're standing in the right place, then when you merely look, regardless of what you have memorized, when you look at things as they are, and you can navigate most usefully. Now, there still might be details you don't see just right. Obviously, you can be standing in the right fundamental place in life and go into a sales presentation or try to rank a website without, if someone hasn't learned SEO yet, and not get it right immediately. It doesn't mean you immediately see all you need to, but you will, in essence, see what you need to do to see better and so forth. It'll all flow from there. And you'll accumulate more of a framework so that there'll be more situations where you have more distinctions, more microscopes and telescopes and magnifying glasses and various things that help you see, questions that you know to ask, nuances to look for in a sales, when you're talking to someone sales wise, all kinds of stuff. You'll accumulate a framework, as I've said many times. The framework will be very helpful. The framework will take place in but it also will tend to be built in the right direction, where it's founded in the right place. Of course, you know that I think very highly of Jesus. I think Jesus was God, and Jesus consistently made this point over and over in all kinds of ways. And if you look for it, you'll see it in a lot of ways, implicitly and explicitly, where Jesus talks about focusing on the rock rather than the detail. Even in the place where he didn't agree with killing the woman caught in adultery, right? He said, let the person who's without sin throw the first stone, and everyone walked away. And then he said, neither do I condemn you. The detail, he wasn't caught up in the detail. She was caught in adultery, therefore she should die. It just wasn't relevant. Relevant is the wrong word. It wasn't foundational. So it wasn't a recipe people should memorize. It didn't matter anymore, right? He wanted people to stand in a place where they examined themselves and got themselves right, and where they showed love and forgiveness towards other people, right? That's where he wanted people to stand. And then perhaps we're standing there and we still absolutely need to kill someone if it's absolutely necessary, right? To have their finger on a nuclear bomb trigger, so to speak, whatever it might be, right? They're about to really keep hurting a lot of people in a significant way. But you don't even need to memorize those situations. You stand in the right place, and then you can either see the right answer, or that it's a gray area. You eyeball it as best you can, and if it's relevant, you build to where you can see better. But you can also see that you can't see some of the detail, right? If you're in that helicopter I talked about and you can see where the town is you have to get to, or if let's say you're still in the forest, but you're in communication with someone who's in a helicopter, then they can see where the town is. And so they can tell you to generally go in that direction, but they might not see where the individual trees are. So they can't tell you which step where to not bang in the trees. You look for that yourself, but it's a matter of priority and which direction you build. And you'll constantly make the right decisions, including, again, you'll see what you don't see. You'll understand you don't see it. When you're standing in the right place, you both see stuff and you don't see stuff, right? If you were to stand on a lookout point and look out in a forest, you would see and you'd realize there are things you don't see, right? The trees obstruct all kinds of views, and some things are blurry. You might see a bird, but it's blurry in the far away. You can't tell what kind of bird it is, but you can tell that, right? When you're standing there. When someone is building from the surface in the wrong direction, then they see what they see, but they don't see all the assumptions and their framework, and they don't see that they don't see it. And that perhaps puts our finger on the real issue, is when you're standing in the right foundational place, the right rock, then you see what you don't see yet. You might get to a point where you can see the stuff you don't currently see by having a telescope or moving somewhere or whatever. But when the way people normally build their view of the world and the way they normally think about individual situations, including like sales presentations, right? If someone tries to get good at sales just through trying recipes, seeing what works, then the scope of their view is narrow, and they're reinforcing any assumptions they have that are invisible to them that they're standing on, as always. So you don't see what you don't see, and what could be tainted by where you're standing, right? Or what you're projecting. When you start with building in the right foundational place, it's profound. You can get clarity on it. Outer frames tend to be knowable versus details are less knowable generally. And again, you can, when you start by, and you have your most basic frames, who you are, what you're trying to accomplish with removing mental conflict, contradictions, having a positive experience, right? In terms of conscious experience, that other people have a better experience rather than worse, that you're seeking understanding, right? Your planning is based on plan A, getting over a threshold. You have your semi-soft lock and getting a sense of what that is, and competence. So these are all outer frames that we've worked with together, right? We're having a sense of cause and effect of what's in your consciousness field. You can understand that God has to exist. When you understand that infinity and that an infinite amount can exist, that further helps understand that there has to be one God, not multiple ones and such. That epistemology is important. This idea here about knowing to look for your foundational frame, building understanding as your overall strategy until you get over your threshold, you hit your target. And then you can assess from there what to do. If you don't hit your ideal when you thought you might, you may gain, you can see what distinctions you've gained and make a new plan of what you're, based on your current understanding of what looks like it'll be the most effective new plan A to get what you want, to get over that threshold, and then repeat, right? Always you're gaining understanding, context, and you will inevitably get your target as long as you don't get annihilated. Or of course, you might realize that you're going to adjust your target based on new understanding. So we have all kinds of outer frames. We can know certain things are incorrect. We obviously have the morality idea, that we want to other people to be better off with their experience, the value of their conscious experience rather than worse, and that we don't want to violate individual property rights. We can look for when we imply all, when you make a statement and you don't qualify it, the law should be obeyed or something like that. Then, or someone should go to jail if they don't obey the law. And then there's an implied all or universality to that statement unless you qualify it. It's not about rhetoric. It's about what's actually going on in your understanding, of course, is what I'm saying. There's a whole bunch of times in life where you have an idea of some, and then you can gain more understanding of the rules when that's going on. You are your power. You have some power directly as a being. You have some knowledge. Your brain has some knowledge. You're not omniscient, but you don't neither do you know nothing, both in terms of your mind and in terms of your conscious experience. You're neither aware of nothing nor are you aware of everything. So you're aware of some stuff. When it comes to individual property rights, it's hard. It's absurd to say that people own nothing. If people own nothing, then we could light them on fire. We could rape people, take any money that they otherwise obviously earned and so forth. None of us act that way in the first second. So we understand that people own something as individuals, but people don't own everything either, right? So people own something. There's a lot of these circumstances where there's some, where the boundaries of where the sum ends might not be immediately clear. But what we do know is that there is some. There's not none, there's not all, and that we want to try to eyeball it as best as we can if it's necessary and things like that. But we know it's a real phenomenon about some, that just because there's no definite boundaries on something that are absolutely clear, it doesn't mean that thing doesn't exist. There's actually something to do with that with words. And I'm not going to go into it too much here, but there's something about various things we put a word to, like our dog or a couch or a tree or whatever, a person, where there's something that is constant about them as their body moves around. The dog loses fur and molecules shift around. Something changes, but something stays the same also. That's why there's a coherence typically to thinking that way. You could explore that if you want. But you have the most basic frames, even the idea of that epistemology, which is how you go about knowing what's true or judging frames if they're correct and so forth. That's critically important to gain more of an understanding of all this stuff. You can then build like inside that whole overall frame and box, but you are so much better off having that and building in that direction. Is of course you're going to build, your raw material is going to be the same as everyone else's, right? You're going to be making observations, having experiences, getting feedback, interacting with people, but you treat it as raw material and you use it to gain distinctions, including about these meta ideas, these outer frames. Whereas other people don't use their observations and experiences and thoughts to improve their meta frames, you will continue to. And so you want to build from the outside in that way. Good. Okay, what I'm going to do then is shift more to office hours for a little while and see what we can gain from that, where I show up and we talk however you want to. If there's something that occurs to me that I want to cover more in a monologue way, then I will. I'll probably announce that ahead of time, but we'll try that for a little while and see where that takes us for the next several weeks. Awesome, guys. Thank you very much. Going to the discussion here now. Does Fletch wrote something? Ha ha ha, that's funny. Just look at my slide and says, yeah, I covered a lot of potentially important topics. Let me see if there's anything here. Managing people, money. What was I saying here about money or thinking? Could look if I have a note in my notebook here. Oh, one example of a sort of rock regarding money. Now, when we're on a subtopic, in one sense, it's a middle frame relative to our most fundamental frames about life. But if we have our outer frames right, then we're looking to get mid frames right as well, right? We're built in the right way. So with money, there's a general frame of wanting to not act as if it's all important. There's a way that people tend to, not every moment, but they'll be pulled back like a gravity to acting like money's all important kind of function, right? Where if their money's threatened, then, or at least if their future income is threatened, they'll be real panicked or angry, upset. Or of course, we do all sorts of things that would otherwise debase us or not what we would want to do because we need to earn money. I don't mean they're in any way immoral and we all need to do them in order to earn money. But things like that, where we might act desperate and realizing that in essence, dealing with money in life is about dealing with acting as if we're desperate for money and getting to a place where we're not is one potential way to approach it. And then, but when you stand there, and when you're trying to earn that, you're trying to earn the ability to not act desperate regarding money through some combination of philosophy and money in your bank account. Right. And I never did discover how to do it through philosophy. If someone does, I had to combine that with just actually having money in I guess in a deep level, we always have our fundamental outer frames. If all our money is wiped out, we can understand how we would move forward without going to pieces or without going to pieces at all. We'd understand that's the current reality and what's now our plan, given the new, obviously there have to be some, if you're at the point where you have money and that goes away, then there would have to be some disaster. So at that point, you would naturally be reassessing what's my new threshold I'm trying to get over, what's my new plan A, my new priority. Your priorities would shift quickly if you went from having money to having obviously disaster and then not having it. And so given that new information, again, you would be obviously formulate a new plan and go for it. And all your understanding that especially meta frames about making money would be very relevant, right? The specific recipe used in the past might not be relevant or exactly applicable, but any kind of meta frames or kind of mid frames would be. Anyhow, so when you're thinking about not being desperate for money, and that is in essence like where I was standing when I was earning money, and it caused me I use that to make decisions and so forth. Whereas a different frame, that assumption that someone else might have, is that they're using money to reinforce that they're awesome, that they can make. Some people, they reinforce the feeling like they can make money by spending it. Right? If they own an expensive watch or car or pay a lot of money for events to go with their girlfriend or something, then mistakenly but if it really gives them the feeling, but of course it's ultimately mistaken, that it makes them feel like they can earn money, right? Because they're spending it. It makes them even feel like they have it because they're spending it. And so they're obviously going about things the wrong way. They didn't focus on standing in the right perspective to make decisions, both about how to earn the money and how to keep it in whatever way that means. You still need to spend some money, so you're making genuine decisions and alternative cost decisions. But you want to stand somewhere where these decisions generally get made mostly useful, right? That's just an example of rock versus recipe, or just going by what's associative, right? Your feelings come from associations in your mind, and those associations are built in this kind of hodgepodge, often contradictory manner. And the outer frames can all be screwed up, and those are invisible, right? You're not seeing them because you're looking forward, so to speak, like with blinders on. And so with money, that's illustrate that. And I talked about obviously self-confidence. If you need to believe that you're already getting results, then in order to feel confident, that's a problem because you have higher highs but lower lows. Similar to if you deal with people through intimidation and things like that and manipulation, wrong type of manipulation, then you might get what you want faster and more reliably when you're strong. But if you have an issue come up where you're temporarily or whatever, you get knocked down by life in some way, then you're going to have a bunch of people ready to kick you while you're down, which is again a hidden thing that's not obvious when someone is operating that way and thinking that and telling other people, yeah, that's how I operate. That's the way to do it. And I run into people like that who think that it works because they observe it to work. Okay. Anyway, that's at least gone over some of what that says there, or a lot, sorry, I've touched on each of those words from magic. Oh, this is David Sharpman, who learned, like he benefited greatly, I would say. Oh, obviously, we're not taking full or any kind of specific partial credit for his success, but he was a member of our teaching. Suleiman, hi, David, and lovely MG. It's great to have you here, Suleiman. Yeah. So the fake it till you make it creates a barrier to long-term success. Again, what you want to do is be able to stand in a place where you can look at that for what it is, which isn't totally wrong, but like drinking your own Kool-Aid is one of the ways that manifests itself. But a lot of what you would otherwise fake, you could prepare in a way that you no longer need to fake that exact same thing, right? If I'm going to think, all right, I want to fake confidence when I go into a sales presentation with a prospective client, then you think you could also ask, what would justifiably give me more confidence, and just do that instead. But then you could, once you do that, you could think what things would signal success. But you have to watch it. It's often irrelevant. Like if you appear busy, it's a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, you must have lots of clients, perhaps, or you're fake. So many people fake that hardly means. Anyway, but if you fake that, it means one thing. But maybe it also means you're hard to reach and not very responsive. Yeah, but think, what am I doing even now? Is you again, first you stand in the right place, then you think, well, what's gonna really make sense and what isn't. It's like a lot of recipes, they're not wrong or right, but they're not foundational. So fake it till you make it. The point is you don't base your success on that. You want to judge from the right vantage point how and when and what you want to fake, and how and when and what you realize now you don't have to fake because you could prepare in advance, or and so forth. What's worth faking because it's easy to fake, you're not going to get caught, and it's fairly harmless, right? And it's implied but not explicitly a lie, that sort of thing. Versus when you do too much fake stuff, it's hard to get your story straight, or you start saying we at the wrong when you're just referring to yourself. Oh yeah, we'll get that done and we'll get this done. And they're like, oh, you have a partner? You're like, no. Anyway, Roberto, I remember hearing that evil, stupid jerk question for the first time from you and thought, what is this about? Where is he going with this? But nowadays, I find myself coming back to that question because it is exactly relevant. I appreciate that, Roberto. It means you've been with us for a long time, right? Since around 2013 or around there. That's a lot of thanks. I'm glad you've been around since then. But yeah, all my stuff is God. It's very, obviously, I'm getting people to challenge boxes that they have a defense against, a defense for, as they talk about in alchemy. Ryan said, wow, this is really clearing up political views. Liberal is basically wanting tyranny, and free market is not a system. Yeah, and as I said, liberalism is like a hodgepodge of rejection of conservatism, right? Conservatism has some manifestations that make sense to reject, but the problem is the rejection often is then hijacked again and their answer isn't right either. Like someone refusing to bake a cake for for a gay wedding. There's an aspect of it worthwhile to reject. I think that people are homosexual or whatever sexual should be treated fully equal. Same as like being left-handed or red hair. And by which I mean both of those are obviously 100%. Like it's almost absurd these days to imply that either one, like even, sorry, not even imply. It's almost absurd to even wrap our head around the idea that one of those could even be thought of as wrong. But both of them have been at certain times and places. But it would be good to think of homosexuality in the same way. And of course I do, and a lot of us do. But some people don't. Both liberals and conservatives, some people don't. But anyhow, but then forcing those people to do so by weight of violence and government is also wrong. Or like with immigration, yeah, being violent toward people walking down the street in essence over a private arbitrary country line is a problem. But then progressives have all kinds of things that they want and do, and that we actually do, that greatly cause and exacerbate the problem, such as all kinds of ways that the government violates its current subject in order to then hand it over to people that walk in, or just the fact that we can vote on violation, right? So since we can vote on taking people's property away and violating them in all sorts of ways, then it's really scary to have people come in that might vote for that. And so it creates all kinds of problems with immigration. Note that if we really didn't want it, we would do it between states or cities, right? It was inherently bad for people to move from one place to the other, or walk from one place to the other, or drive, that we would have it more pervasive. So it's not inherently right. Oh, it's inherently wrong to just be violent towards a stranger who's just traveling. But I understand the practical benefits in some cases. But if those benefits were so as relevant as people think, then why wouldn't we do it between states? Anyhow, just respond to that a little bit. Yay, I got good talk. Funny. And specifically, what I'm against, when I say government doesn't exist, what I mean is there's no moral. And the funny thing is, everyone believes this if they stop thinking about it, which they don't. They basically believe it while also not believing it, right? People have a lot of contradictions because they think backward, like they acquire their belief systems inside out, right? Through kind of observations and experiences. And then that's how they accumulate contradictory thoughts. But in a number of ways, people don't believe that government is such a thing that can just make a obviously immoral action moral, right? Everyone has various things that they view as fundamentally immoral. And then if you say, what if government just said it was okay, would it make it okay? They say, of course not. So that doesn't exist. And once that doesn't exist, once government no longer has the ability to make something immoral into something moral, then it basically disappears as a practical thing in the way that people are referring to it now. Like with the justice system, right? Vigilantism is immoral, which it isn't. But if it is, how could like the idea of the justice system is that vigilantism, we shouldn't take the law into our own hands. And so, interesting that with a standing army or police, it's like welfare for self-defense. And we all act, including myself, like welfare queens when it comes to self-defense. When I say we all, some people might not. But even then, most everyone's unprepared for a large-scale invasion, right? They depend on the army, even people who are into guns and stuff. Anyway, some people might not be acting like they're on welfare, but I certainly do, right? Where I'm basically helpless when it comes to self-defense. Same thing with healthcare. People used to have these healthcare co-ops that flourished and they were great. I'm in what amounts to one now, although it's Obamacare compliant and so, and they're awesome. But they hardly exist anymore because the government took it over, right? Put that system on welfare, so to speak, and then people act helpless. There's a lot of instances, both in America and throughout history in different countries. The famous example of where a guy from Soviet Russia asked Thatcher, how do you see to it that people have bread or food? And they see to it themselves, right? And so when you create a system of welfare in a particular area, I don't just mean with direct payouts, right? But with defense or planning, any kind of thing where the government steps in, then people start to feel and act helpless when they otherwise wouldn't be. But then people observe that as the reality and they can't imagine otherwise, right? In Soviet Russia, they couldn't imagine how people could feed themselves without communism. In many cases, in our current society, we tend to not be able to imagine how we could build a road or defend ourselves from either criminals or invaders, whatever that might mean. Like not really invaders, right? More like Vikings, right? Like people that come over and like loot and pillage or whatever. How can they can't imagine defending ourselves without government, right? But that's just the same as anyone on welfare that can't imagine how they could do it if someone wasn't doing it for them. Yeah, you can because you don't have a framework because someone's doing it for you. But if we didn't do like a welfare system, then you could do it. In Russia right now, they can't imagine how they could fill their army without slavery. They have full-on slavery of young boys that are like 18 in Russia. It's why my son can't be a Russian citizen. My wife is a dual citizen. She's Russian and American. She came over like 13 years ago. We've been married, of course, ever since. But my son, who's 6, he's an American citizen. Of course, he was born here. But he could become a citizen of Russia, and it would make it easier to travel there and see his grandparents. But we can't do it because he'd literally be enslaved in a way that, in this case, you guys could probably really identify with my calling it slavery. They literally would take him bodily and force him to join their army, pay him nothing. Not that it would matter if he's paid at that point. And it's very brutal psychologically and physically. And so it's totally sick. Her brother had to deal with that in a certain way in very real terms. So when I talk about these things, it's very real in the world. This is not just far away, impossible stuff. Megan says, David, this might be a question for a Q&A webinar. How about death? I have a view on this that I think is very, you probably know it to some degree, but I find it very useful. And that is that now I'm a Christian, but a lot of what people think of as Christianity is just man-made, right? So I fully believe that Jesus was God and so forth. I wouldn't act on my interpretation of something Jesus said if it was going to violate someone, because that's just my interpretation and I know not to violate. But there's nothing where that tempts me. There's nothing that I have off the top of my head that Jesus said. Of course, that could be interpreted that way anyway. Anyhow, in terms of life after death, the idea that we have one life and that's it, and then there's some kind of permanent resolution after that, I pointed out the problems with that. I do not know what happened. I strongly presume we're not annihilated, right? I presume that after we die from this life, that there's nothing whatsoever. That wouldn't really make sense with suffering. God, at that point, God might as well just have put us in a permanent state of bliss rather than give us this world. Like this is clearly like some sort of transitional situation, right? With a point, meaning there would be no real reason for this world to be the way it is without it being part of something else that goes on. What I think is completely plausible, and I have absolutely no idea, and I'm not saying it's the case or not, but it's plausible. And just thinking that it's plausible has profound implication. I think it's plausible that we could live multiple lives on. Obviously, most all of our memories and stuff is wiped out at that point. So it wouldn't be a whole lot that was carried forward. But it's also plausible that if we get things fundamentally right, then God wouldn't need to wipe out nearly as much or everything, whatever, right? Currently, basically nobody has arrived at foundational ideas. And so we don't really know what happened as people start to. There's so many upsides of thinking that it's possible, just as possible. We don't know. And there's clear problems with the idea that we live one life on earth, right? The traditional Christian idea that we live one life on earth after which there's a permanent resolution, one more idea, heaven, hell, or whatever the heck else. That is very problematic, right? I pointed out why. One big hint that isn't the case is the fact of it and the possibility of it, right? The idea that people go to hell after one life on earth makes no sense in a world. And I don't mean to make no sense to me, like just emotionally, logically, there's nowhere to go with it, right? If people live one life on earth and then God judges them and sends them to heaven or hell, no matter what you do with a young child when they die, it makes no sense. If they go to heaven, then it makes no sense. Because then what? They hit on one particular day. Now they have the possibility of going to hell, right? Right? Logically, right? If a child is 3 years old and can only go to heaven if they die, let's just say, then at some point, either on a particular day, age, or decision or something, now they can all of a sudden go to hell, right? That thought. And it also means that we might as well kill the kid when they're 3, right? Because then they go to heaven forever, and that's a lot better than whatever living their life on earth for the rest of their life and then having a possibility of hell, right? So that belief entails that we should kill infants, or we just believe that infants can go to hell, which is just weird. It just doesn't make it. There'd be no benefit. And even if an 80-year-old could go to hell, there'd be nothing in it for God. There'd be the overall, God would always, just like we should always want a possibility of someone, whatever you call it, changing their mind, basically doing something that could improve their situation. God is aware of what we're aware of, which means that if a person's suffering, then God's aware of that suffering, which means God's suffering. So there's an interesting idea too. So the one life on earth and then a permanent resolution can't see how to make that work. I can't see how to make annihilation work. Maybe there's something where there's some other intermediate or ongoing thing that doesn't involve another life on earth. Who knows? And maybe I'm missing something with one of the solutions I wrote off. Again, genuinely don't know. I'm not advocating a particular position. But once we look at it as particularly plausible that you could have multiple lives on Earth, it resolves a lot. It makes us more respectful of the Earth, right? Humans still come, not humans, consciousness, conscious beings are primary. Everything else is just secondary to their experience, right? Just a reason for their experience. But the state of the Earth is relevant to people's conscious experience. So, of course, we would want to be reasonable with that. Racism would evaporate more, as would almost any kind of ism, because if it's even if it's plausible that I could have been had lives previously or in the future, it means I could easily have been a woman, different races, different nationalities, and so right. It also means if we make life miserable for the Russians now, or vice versa, then we could end up being born there and being screwed by that later. So it's shockingly useful to look at it as a possibility. I actually don't know of any drawbacks. There might be some, but I haven't thought of any. So it's actually a pretty useful ideology. And it's only based on being clear about what I do know, which is just seeing dead ends and with various conclusions that people typically have. Let me see. You talk about if they die and revive, they're mostly unchangeable. Beinghood as a whole. No, just the fact that someone can die and be revived and their same personality, that's not their being. Your mind is not who you are, period, just logically speaking. That for sure. Your mind can change, and therefore it's not you. You're a being, you're almost like a placeholder that is conscious of whatever your conscious field is and responsible for, or you get the impact of whatever power you have, however much that impact, or however much impact you can have, then that impact you do have, and you can take advantage of it or less positively, and that'll lead to things that those are characteristics of you as a being. Obviously, you're tied to a mind in this life on Earth, but then, and some of that might be ported forward in some fashion, right? But how much of that and so forth. Remember, your mind isn't even ported forward in your own life, right? Like your mind that you have when you're 20, some of that has changed or been forgotten in terms of memories, changed in terms of personality. So you don't even keep your mind during your lifetime on Earth, and yet you still have a sense of being the same you. And so therefore there could be some amount of change or losing stuff or whatever, and whatever comes after, and you still be you and you're a being. So hopefully that explains things and gives you some distinctions. Dave, and again, we're weirdly useful. Oh, you know what else is useful about that? Is there's something I actually think of telling you guys sometimes. I think of a bunch of stuff and then it doesn't always get integrated right into a presentation. There's a way that ruthlessness idea is very interesting. And also, let me start by illustrating it with a movie. I ruthlessly want to get immersed in a movie as long as that's the right decision, which it typically is, right? If you're going to watch a movie in the first place, you might as well get into it, right? You might as well clear your environment and just be able to get into it. Both your mind being scattered and your environment being pinging you and interrupting you, you'd rather not. You'd rather get into it assuming that the movie itself is decent. In that way, but at the same time, you obviously want to understand that a movie is a movie. So relative to a person who always had one foot in and one foot out in both directions, where they forgot that movies were just movies, but they also didn't quite get into the movie very much. They were interrupted or checking Facebook. They would have problems on both ends. They would not benefit from immersion while simultaneously not benefit from perspective, we might call it, realizing a movie is just a movie or a game is just a game. When it comes to this particular life on Earth, with the way that I look at things, I get both benefits the same way as I illustrated with the movie. I don't look at this life on Earth as like such an end all be all thing. Like people take their life way overly seriously in a certain way. Even death is just not that big of a deal to me. So I just, and then on purpose, I can get immersed in a particular task or in life as a whole on purpose when it's useful. But there's an overall way that I don't take life as serious as a lot of people do. I don't mean that I laugh at myself or laugh at life. It's different than that. It's just the same as understanding a movie's a movie, understanding that both this life is what it is, and also, and that things will probably just get better somehow. If I die at all, who knows? We don't know what's going to happen with, or any of us. I'm talking about me specifically. We don't know what'll happen as we start to get our foundational frames correct. So you guys know, I acknowledge God consistently. I want to make sure you guys are aware of that distinction. You do what you want, given that God exists and God's awesome and God knows what's best within what can be known, right? Like God's, at least God eyeballing things for the future is better than, is going to be as good or better than anything that I can eyeball, right? So I acknowledge God. I pray for God's will to be done, whatever that might be, and God to increase my understanding. I do that consistently in case that's relevant. But I was talking about where there's a way that I don't take life overly seriously in the sense of thinking that it's like the end all be all. And if something ends up with me dying, then I die. Like it's just not, it doesn't, for example, it's more important to not violate someone else's property than it is to stay alive. I would say if it was a minor thing that I could pay back, I might do that. I would do that and pay it back and not before I could, and I couldn't answer it. Come up with some situation where I have to minorly violate someone's property or minor is anything I could basically pay back or can or would pay back. But if it had to do with something that I couldn't, anyway, it's stuff you could think about once you have the right perspectives and you can look at it yourself. David, I have a question about boundaries. I was trying to get more clarity about what my boundaries were, and I recognized that I had a goal, which was don't make people feel bad. Exactly. That's not a correct boundary. I went on a rant, I think it was an alchemy at some point, and talked about, in a similar vein, how harmful and counterproductive it is to teach your kids not to hurt other people as a foundation. Of course, all things being equal, you'd rather not hurt someone. But what you want to teach kids is not to violate other people's property, which is very different than not harming them. And one of the ways this comes about is that when you're violated, it's like you haven't been violated unless you can make yourself feel really bad and appear to be a victim to other people, which is that's one of the horrible, right? Or if you imagine taking money from someone rich, oh, they won't feel it, right? It won't hurt them, right? So all these property rights violations are justified. Slavery is justified in all sorts of various ways by greater good or that's that or the other. So don't make people feel bad. The problem is people can use that to manipulate you. Of course, again, all things being equal, I definitely rather people feel good. But of course, if you were a dentist or doctor, then obviously you might need to tell them the truth, perform an operation or a procedure that would cause them pain, emotional and or physical, and it might be necessary, right? People need to believe that all their outer frames are right, and they're already so smart, they do everything right, they can't take criticism often. And as a practical matter, we don't want that to rebound on us where we criticize them in a way that's going to screw ourselves over because they're now pissed off at us or they're sullen and they don't do their project. So of course you have to be practical and smart about that, but it's not a foundation or a boundary. It's a thing that you see and navigate rather than it's just not a boundary. Basically, it's unhelpful as a boundary. It's whenever it comes up, it's either going to be obvious that of course you don't want to make someone feel bad. You know what I mean? Or it's going to actually interfere or be unhelpful. Even in like a marriage, sometimes you just have to discuss things and the person's going to not want to discuss them, but you have to. And I'd rather get through a good thing or solve something that's an issue or express how something makes me feel or what something's like from my perspective as a priority. Like as a priority in my marriage, I want us to be happy and I want her to have a sense of how I'm feeling if it's if it's going to be recurring or relevant, or just have something, it's not just how I'm feeling, but how something looks from my perspective, which some perspective. And then when I say that, I'm not talking about things where I'm definitely right. So just how you experience it. But yeah, you really don't want to make that a priority where some people feel like they're actually making progress if they're intimidating somebody or getting what they want. That's not what you want to do either, right? But you just, neither one of those is basically where you want to look for boundaries or progress. Flight said, this is massive, Dave. Super share and drawing attention to this in case anyone missed it. I think this has affected a lot of us. Yeah, that don't make people feel bad, boundary great, and don't harm people is similar because it tends to revert the same meaning. Again, obviously, I don't want to harm people, all things being equal, or even if they're unequal, but I'm making a choice. Of course, I prefer not to harm, so I might make a sacrifice or find another route to something. I certainly care how people feel. I want to understand how people are going to feel so that overall I can make a good judgment about how to talk to them, what battles to fight, what battles not to fight. If I'm working with partners, if they're going to feel bad about doing something or a certain criticism, I might avoid it if all things being equal. Looking at the totality of the situation, it's not worth it. But again, it's not a boundary. It's more of something to understand and weigh. Weigh is in WEIGH. Great. Thanks, man. Thanks for that question. Kind of similar with sales, right? You don't want to be like, oh, I don't want to come across like a salesperson or sell. That's not a place to start. If you're choosing between two approaches and one of them is going to leave you more open to future advances, then pick that one. right? Same thing with dating and relationships. If one approach is going to leave you better off for the future, then of course pick it. But if it's between not having a possibility of someone, dating you that you want to date, or being a little awkward, then you probably want to pick the one possibility. Same thing with sales, right? So there you go. Lawrence. That's such a good illustration, right, of these hidden frames that have so many ripple effects or practical effects that if we don't see them and see, we don't really see them. How do I say that we see stuff? By looking from a perspective, which means we have to find the deepest perspectives, the broadest. They don't allow us to see everything in terms of every detail, but they allow us to then see the middle boxes, things like this questioning about making people feel that, right? So you could see that and think about it. You're not without standing on it while you're thinking on it. You can't think about the boat that you're rowing on in the middle of the sea, right? You can't switch boats or you'll drown, right? When people don't have a place to stand outside of a box or a belief system, then they're too scared they're both too blind and scared to look at them. So it's great that you're able to be standing somewhere to get you to ask that question in the first place. And then we could be standing somewhere to allow us to answer it. And incredibly practical, because now we're operating on kind of these middle frames like that one. And then that has a ripple effect of getting things right in terms of practical decisions, things that you say, responses to people, and so forth. But at Alchemy, I talked for a few webinars, I think, about being respectful aggressive. People who are worried about making people feel bad, they tend to act passive aggressive. And passive aggressive is way more common, right? People would want to believe they're not passive aggressive because it's such a bad connotation. Earned, it should have a bad connotation, but it's absolutely, see, it's how people act by default. It's basically how everyone acts by default, and also how we're trained by our parents and so forth, passive aggressive. So you want to be respectful aggressive and be going for what's really better and then approach it in as respectful a way as you can. But I go at length in Alchemy about that. I don't remember exactly where, maybe in the late teens, but someone might know better. Early 20s, not sure. Lawrence says, does this parallel what you taught us about frames and learning? Yeah, it does. In that our minds take details and fill out the framework and then use that framework to go fill in. Yeah, that's right. When it comes to learning, if you're not blocked, you're going to then your mind will probably automatically do this. You can probably help it along. I don't know off the top of my head a good way to explain how, but you want to come up with these kind of central concepts that kind of hold things together. Your mind will tend to do that and create. Then it could be that sometimes your mind will create a framework that's a bit of a duct tape type framework. And you might be able to improve on it. Something that kind of core idea to hold things together. It's possible that it might duct tape that together in a way that's not ideal. And that if you look for it and work on it, you could find a more central concept, like electronegativity in chemistry, as I say, is a central concept. And something like water running through pipes with like electromagnetism, perhaps, is a central representation that can help understand that constructively. With SEO, Greg has those three main ideas, or the sink or swim idea is kind of one central idea, that sort of thing. And Fletch has his scheme that I'm sure works well with Greg's. Both your mind will build something. It may be adequate. And if it's not happening, then you can try to help it along, and I'll hopefully come up with something better than just telling you that. But that gives an overall sense. Let me just see if I have a drink here. Okay. And then you went on to say, what I'm understanding is that it is not how understanding is built because from the outside in, that learning is through associations that I might. Yeah, learning is different than understanding. Learning is a bunch of associations. Again, better if you have a kind of a deep sense of what I mean, and then you can look at what I'm talking about and you'll come to the same conclusion naturally. And you may already be able to. Once you can see just a mental picture of how your brain will associate one thing with another, which is different than building. If you're a conservative, then you have you listen to Rush Limbaugh and each time you listen, right? It goes for 3 hours a day minus commercials, and you'll pick up a lot of stuff. And you'll have a response. You'll have a bunch of responses to various arguments. You'll pick up useful things, this and that. You'll pick up some deeper frames that I might disagree with, et cetera. But people that are into that fully, where they're immersed, they have a bunch of associations, but some of their frames are having to do with there's a certain respect that fundamental respect that conservatives have for government and for the enforcers of government, that and a necessity of government and law and justice system, and certain views about immigration and stuff. No, I don't caricature them. I'm not as progressives do, but they still have certain ideas about immigration that at times are unhelpful. All kinds of stuff. So you'll have a bunch of this, you'll learn, and so it'll be this relates to this relates to this, or this is the response to this, or this is the argument for this, is justification for that. And it's not built in a clear, coherent way, or it's not viewed from a fundamental perspective where everything is seen clearly and flows. There's topics where if you're learning how to fix a car and how to do auto mechanics, then things that are like particularly tangible like that, the typical learning process, if you don't have it blocked, will probably unfold well, where you'll overall develop a framework that is helpful and accurate in the sense it's going to be consistently useful for the situation. And then you'll remember details better later, right? After that, your mind builds that. And then if you're learning things that are more flawed, then of course you'll be absorbing the flaws or implicitly absorbing some of the assumptions or the frames that they have, right? Like in school, you're rewarded for having answers, and you tend to be implicitly a little bit nagged for having questions. You're not like punished for having questions typically, but you tend to get a little bit of an overall negative for having questions and more of a reward for the result. And then the mind will associate knowing the answers with being smart. You're not just rewarded with actual grades, you're affirmed, right? Oh wow, you're smart, you know the answer. So then they learn that smart is someone that knows the answer, right? But answers are typically associated. They might be correct, they might be incorrect, but they're like regurgitated one way or the other. They're just a bunch of memorized knowledge, like quoting Shakespeare, oh, you're smart. And it's all irrelevant to solving problems like as an entrepreneur, right? Where you need to ask questions, connect dots, find bottlenecks. You might not see rewards for a long time. Same thing in human relationships. You develop a bunch of counterintuitive like frames for human relationships when you're in school and you're getting rewarded for results and having the answers. And it reinforces this idea that a smart person is someone that already knows the answer, right? And that's what learning does, is you learn a bunch of stuff, but you pick up frames from as well. And some of those can be insidious like that. Lauren says, I guess I'm just trying to make sure that I'm digesting all this correctly and not defaulting to try to memorize everything you say. Yeah. And the way to digest it is to really get straight on some of the basic ideas that we're talking about, right? And you're standing there and you're examining and thinking about what I'm saying and building it for yourself. I know I'm being a little bit vague even as I say that. Let me reread what you said. You said, what I'm understanding is that it is not how understanding is built, that learning is not how understanding is built because it's from the outside in. Yeah, with understanding, you are getting the same input to start with. It's a great question, by the way. I appreciate this. It's like with that Zen koan, where it says before enlightenment, drawing water or chopping wood or something like that. And then after enlightenment, drawing water or chopping wood. A person who's seeking understanding and a person who is just learning is getting the same input to start with, same raw material. Sometimes by luck, learning will functionally be the same as understanding. And that is when what you're absorbing or associating as raw material is useful without being processed. When you're seeking understanding, you're adding a part of the process where, I know I'm being a little metaphorical and therefore vague for a moment, but at least to give something. You're adding an ingredient, you're adding a methodology that kind of refines the raw material. So a person who does a sales presentation and gets rejected might learn, quote unquote, that real estate agents don't want SEO, or learn that they're not a good salesperson. You know what I mean? Whereas a person who's seeking understanding will not, quote unquote, learn that. They'll get raw material and they can think about, now, if the only raw material you have is some rejection, it's a little hard. But what it does do is give you some kind of backdrop. So now if you go read a book about sales, like the one about the 10 commitment that I recommended, then you Think about it. Let's say you go and try to make two sales presentations and you don't have someone say, and then you read that book about 10 commitments, or you don't do those two sales presentations. You don't have much other background and you just start reading that book. Who's going to remember the book better and get more out of it? Especially if you have the attitude of building understanding, you'll get more distinctions. It's not just you'll remember more or learn that what he says in the book is exactly the right way to go about it, right? He's the type of sales that guy does might be different than the type of sales that you're doing, but you're you're gaining kind of questions. You have an easier time picturing and remembering when you hear advice about sales, if you've gone out and done it sometimes. All of that is potential raw material, right? If you do two sales presentations and get more out of a book, that means something happened in those sales presentations that you got. But that could be blocked if a person doesn't look for it, doesn't seek it. So it's there, but it's not used unless you seek it. All this is further helping. I know that it's not too exact. Suleiman says, David, is it correct to say that you can learn something wrong, but you can never understand anything wrong? Yeah, that's correct. And of course, there's different usages of these words, but there's a way that really helps. And I've said something similar at times. Again, there's usages of the word understanding. There might even be usages once in a while that I might have used that might violate that, but that really helps point to the type of thing I'm saying. Because distinctions, like, good, thanks, Lauren, that it made things clear. Because if you do those two sales presentations, don't have a yes, and then something's helping you still, right, when you're reading a book. And so that points to that there's understanding, that there's something that it's useful, that isn't wrong. Conclusions are the types of things that can be wrong. Distinctions can't be wrong, but it can take either practice or a distinction in and of itself to see the difference. But take note of what I'm about to say. It's extremely critical and useful to be able to distinguish what a conclusion is. Believe it or not, people don't really realize, and they don't see conclusions. If you couldn't tell two shades of green from each other or two notes that were different in tone, which I probably couldn't, or they have to be right there next to each other. I couldn't remember it very well. For me, a conclusion is very clear that it's a conclusion at this point. It's one of the things I'm skilled at. For a lot of people, it's much more, they don't realize they think that something just is the way it is, in a sense. Like, even if someone says I'm not good at sales, or real estate agents don't buy SEO or something like that, then by that, it's nothing to do with reality. When I say real estate, I'm just picking that in my little scenario. I'm not making any statement about SEO and real estate, but those are conclusions, right? You don't learn a conclusion, you conclude a conclusion. You learn an association. Associations are inherently neither true nor false. You see, an association, truth necessarily involves matching. And that statement in practice, people don't realize. You guys might, but in general, people have no idea that that's the case. They think that associations can be true, whereas associations are constantly between two things that are not identical. If someone says, imagine giving a sales presentation, then you can picture something, perhaps, especially if you've done it. But what you picture is not identical to the meaning of a sales presentation. You're picturing like an instance or highlights or triangulation point that come to mind that are associated with a sales presentation. You're not picturing the totality of, or the archetype of, or whatever, the meaning of sales presentation. And this is a critical fundamental point. That, like, understanding about conclusions and about what an association is, that truth involves matching. I know I'm talking about here at the end, not in a monologue and kind of a discussion, but don't let that imply that it's any less crucial. So conclusions can be learned if you're not careful. Associations are associations. Whether or not they're learned is irrelevant, or it's always true. Like, an association, to have something be associated in your mind is synonymous with having learned it. What you can do is distinguish between things you act on versus things that you affirm are true or stipulate. You might notice there's various times, and I'll say I'm talking about this is based on my like historical knowledge or my best knowledge of this topic, but it doesn't make it true, right? I'm consistently aware that my talk about various things that are inherently or historical or based on quote unquote facts or scientific facts, whatever, they're not necessarily true. They're not known in the same way as where the opposite couldn't possibly be true or that sort. Once we understand associations as what they are, which are associations, and that learning is basically a synonym for that. An association can be useful, but they're neither true nor false in a sense. If I say, remember what you did yesterday, the phrase what you did yesterday, you can't picture that exactly. What would that even mean? Every action of every molecule in your body yesterday, do you picture that all at once? Or you not obviously you couldn't even picture it slowly over time. You see what I'm saying? There's no matching that. It's not about whether it's true or false. What you could do is picture something about what you did yesterday that's relevant to the situation that's helpful, or something about a sales presentation that's relevant and helpful. So associations, again, are neither true nor false. They're association. A conclusion, sometimes people can have either beliefs they act on or conclusions they affirm that they're true when they're nothing of the sort. They're neither true nor false. Other times, conclusions can be judged true or false if they're of a different sort, that's like logic. Once you can see associations for what they are, then you can start to answer your questions about how learning and understanding relate. Associations provide a relevant backdrop for understanding. If you had no memory at all, of course, then you couldn't really be said to understand anything. But then a distinction is different than an association. Associations or memory or picturing anything or seeing anything gives you a backdrop that makes a distinction possible. But you couldn't make a distinction between a otter and an aardvark if you couldn't remember or associate or picture or learn anything past that you could draw on from a memory. A distinction between them, which doesn't have to be every difference between them, but any difference between them, anything you can picture or see or note that's different. Or if you realize to ask a certain question in a sales presentation, whereas previously you didn't, like, oh, this person might mean two different things by saying, I don't have the money. They could mean, I need to ask a partner, or maybe it's not just two things, right? But instead of a novice salesperson might think that there's only one meaning, the meaning that just pops to mind for the novice salesperson, if I don't have the money. They might think that literally there's not enough money in the bank account to buy this, or their budget or something. A more experienced salesperson could be aware of several possibilities that might mean. So that's distinctions. You see, those distinctions are related to understanding. The distinctions are true as distinctions, and they're useful as distinctions and understanding. Learning and associating you did from the past provided the raw material that allows you to make distinctions. Distinctions are either irrelevant or useful. They're irrelevant if they just don't happen to help you come to any useful decisions or conclusions, but they're helpful. But the more distinctions increase understanding, or they're irrelevant, but they're not false. You can see different. Perhaps someone could create a meaning of distinction where it could possibly be false, but if you just follow what I'm saying and make what I'm saying true, then you'll get the same meaning that I intend, and it's useful. Right? If you see that if you look at two paintings and they're clearly different, then those are not the same painting, is what I'm saying. There's something about a distinction that has to be correct as a distinction. And the more distinctions you have that are relevant, the more understanding you have. And inherently, if you have more distinctions, you have more associations and backdrop, right? Generally, right? Because memory associations, experiences, inputs, raw material, they all lead to where you can make distinctions. But if you don't look for distinctions, your mind will actually tend to blur and forget and delete and marginalize distinctions. So the making and noticing and using of distinctions can be blocked. And that's by seeking understanding, you're, in a sense, unblocking distinctions that then can help you to have knowledge, right? Distinctions are knowledge in the sense with a capital K. Remember, they might be irrelevant, but they're knowledge. And the more relevant distinctions you have about a particular topic, the better off you are. And that inherently means you have more. That's why it goes along with association. It's hard to tell the difference until I explained all this. I'm really glad I got to explaining all this in the way that I did. Was that new for you guys to a certain extent? Probably made sense at some point for some of you. And also had a certain newness to it. like a lot of this capstone series where it relates to a lot of what I said before. In a sense, I've said it before, but in a sense, wow, it's an hour since I started discussion. So obviously that got me going. I'll say to bring things to a close. I just refreshed. Have there really been no comments for the last 40 minutes? It seems like it's wrong. Let me try one more time. And maybe there haven't been. Maybe it's been within that thread and I didn't notice. I don't mind if there weren't comments. I just don't want to, through technology, accidentally think there's no comments when there were. Yes, loved it. Okay, that makes things clear. You said it 10 minutes ago. Great. Mike said, hooray, what an incredible presentation. I'm looking forward to the office hours event to come. Great. Mike said that, I think, at the end of my presentation. Thank you, Mike. Sula and David, love the summary of frames you made toward the end. It's amazing how much you taught us over the years. Thanks a lot. You're very welcome. I thought of another quick point about fairness, by the way. Fairness doesn't have to only be about money. It was a correct concept. I thought of like burn victims, right? Some children have been badly burned in a way they're not going to recover from, which is tragic. To be fair, we'd have to burn everyone that same way. And obviously, we don't approve of that. Fairness is not a foundational thing. When we look accurately at a situation, there's times we would want to be fair, but that flows from like standing in the right place, seeing things accurately. It's not a place to stand. You see, it can be very wrong other times. Whenever anything can be wrong, especially predictably so, like with fairness, it's easy to come up with horrible things based on fairness off the top of our head, no problem. And so whenever you spot something where something can be wrong, you don't stand on it, right? There might be an aspect of it that can be stood on if you were to distinguish the part that's wrong, right? You might have you can imagine some place you could theoretically stand, but half of it, like Indiana Jones, right? You're in there exploring the Temple of Doom, and there's parts of the floor you can stand on, there's parts you can't, but you don't want to stand on the floor in that case because half of it'll kill you. You need to figure out the puzzle and where you can stand, which is foundational, where you can't. Okay, I might have to do other stuff that opens up cold stuff. No comments, problem mesmerized, very funny. And you commented in the thread. Okay, so there actually were no comment down below because people were commenting in the threads and so forth. Okay, super. Either mesmerized or confused or some combination thereof. Great, super. Finding distinctions feels like it has more weight than before. Yeah, great, exactly. Look for them. And because remember, what's going on is I've talked about this, how our mind is dealing with so much potential input and it has to project order onto chaos, which means that it literally what it does to do that, a major part of projecting order in chaos, which is necessary because we would have too much to deal with consciously without our brain doing so much of it automatically for us outside of what we consciously are aware of. So literally our brain and our mind have to blur and delete, paint over, and whatever you want to say it, a bazillion distinctions every moment, right? Every photon compared to another photon is like a distinction, right? It's different than another photon. If our brain gave us all those differences, like separately, we would be utterly overwhelmed. And so nearly every distinction is papered over, right? And potential discrepancy and so forth. Now you might say, then wouldn't seeking understanding confuse the heck out of us? Yeah, somehow it all works. That's that for the moment. But there's a way that you need to seek understanding about what's important, right? You don't seek understanding about what's unimportant. As I said, then there's all kinds of irrelevant things you could notice. You could look around your room and notice a bazillion distinctions that you would have noticed if you didn't look for it. Although that's an interesting exercise to illustrate what I mean. If you look around your room, just physically, whatever room you're in, and you on purpose look to notice a bunch of distinctions physically, like I'm noticing stuff about my cabinets that I never really stopped to notice, then you'll notice them. But that's a great illustration. Now that shows probably irrelevant, right? In that case, but it shows how you can just by changing what you're looking for, what you're asking, you're really where you're standing, right? In a certain way, you are noticing distinctions that you wouldn't notice before, or your mind is pointing out distinctions for you to consciously then be aware of that weren't there before. So same thing then about deeper frames or what's important. Or if someone does sales presentation, doesn't work out, if you ask, gosh, why am I so stupid or why am I such a bad salesperson, then your brain will give you distinctions about that. But if you ask yourself just what will, it's something even just simple, what will help me understand sales better? Or remember, once we really feel that we can crush anything over time by gaining a framework, the framework will build, right? Then we ask constructive questions and start to gain useful distinctions, not just any distinction about, and the process might then involve talking to other people. And They help us see stuff. But we're looking for distinctions that are by asking constructive questions about how you can be better and build in the future. And you definitely can be better in the future. I also had a thought during this week. One of the many details I say pops into my head, but then it doesn't always get worked in. Physically, which is where we get a lot of our metaphors, our mind does, in terms of how the world works, is just how the physical world works, but a lot of them don't apply to how the mental world works. But physically, frameworks don't build the same way they do in our mind in terms of learning. So let's say you try to push an object, then, and it doesn't budge, then that's pretty much how it's going to be. You might be able to get leverage, get another object and push it, but and of course you could theoretically work out and maybe push it if there's a small difference. And I'm not thinking this isn't necessarily the greatest illustration of what I'm trying to say physically, but physically things either do what they do or they don't. Like physical laws happen the way they happen or not. There's not really a lot of framework that gets built to make major changes physically. There are some places where you can come up with places where it does, right? But there's a way that it doesn't really hit us as a framework in a lot of cases. What am I trying to say here? A little bit with exercising and getting stronger and being able to run farther. But even then, if you try to run somewhere, it just feels like you can run a certain distance and then you can't run anymore. You don't often even feel like if you kept trying to run, like you could run a lot farther. You might intellectually affirm that to some degree, but you don't tend to feel that. But this might not be illustrating it as well as it felt like to me. I thought earlier in the week, earlier today. But anyway, you can explore it for yourself. The idea that the physical world frameworks don't build in front of our face in an obvious way, where it gets integrated into our understanding of the world and our belief system, whereas mentally frameworks really build, right? And things just extrapolate a lot better often in the physical world, whereas mentally, it would be better if I had some more concrete examples. They'll occur to me later, I'm sure, like a good comeback that occurs to you later. But anyway, think about that and work on it if you want. All right. Okay. On that note, I guess I'll wrap up this webinar and then I'll be here next week and we can continue with things. You can repost some if you feel like, hey, David, you said you would get some questions in a previous thread. I can look at them, but you can also just show up and repost them, which that way you are, right? And I can address it that way. But that's very valid if you want to do that. Assuming this looks like it might be a great thing to repost in a future webinar with consciousness field and not matching in priority. Yeah, good point. These are all kind of fundamental ideas and I might not have connected them all that great. So I can potentially think about it or work on it in a webinar and office hours and that sort of thing. You're very welcome. Glad you left tonight. The takeaway overall was what? It was the rock versus recipe, right? Where you focus on trying to understand where to look from. And I've given you a number of illustrations about that to try to give you a sense of it. And then you can also work on it yourself instead of just trying to assume that your overall perspective is right and just trying to find a recipe, as I kind of illustrated in a number of ways. Oh, somehow my real poignant illustration for me is how I'll vote based on in a national election, or if it's a Republican versus Democrat, I will purely look at in a primary, of course, it's a place to pick your ideal candidate if you could have the information to know, which you probably can't. But if you could, at least know something. But once it's a Republican versus Democrat, then I'll vote based on party exclusively. And I don't care, literally, the guy could literally be a satanic mass murderer. And I would still vote for the one party rather than the other. And not emotionally, but I think practically speaking, that makes sense. Like a mass murderer of a particular party is probably just going to block a vote the same as everyone else in that party. And the most wonderful guy, the guy in my district that's a Democrat, is trying to say, and my district is more Republican. So of course he's trying to say he's not really a Democrat. But how much you want to bet if and when he's elected, which he's going to vote exactly the same as Nancy Pelosi on every single issue. And that's that. And so they say, so it doesn't matter what his character is, what he says, how nice he sounds or doesn't nice, it's just irrelevant. And it doesn't matter if the Republican's a mass murderer. If I want someone to block vote Republican, if my only choice is block vote Republican or block vote Democrat, then I choose the one that I prefer to be block voted, whatever that might be. And my point is not about politics there. My point is it's a very poignant illustration of like people accuse other people. Here's a proof of how this is my overall point is often counterintuitive. People accuse people of being partisan or ignoring someone's character or not caring about this or that. I proudly state that I could care less what someone, of course, all things being equal, just like with the fairness thing, whatever, obviously I'd rather the person I'm voting for otherwise be a terrific guy and have a character, or a woman and have a great character. But I proudly say it's irrelevant. I'm not partisan. I don't like Republicans. and I have issues with plenty of their ideas and their assumptions. But in my case, because of the issues that I think have more impact on everyone, not just myself, I greatly prefer the way they're going to block it rather than them. And plus the way that they're going to reinforce various ideas overall, and plus the ripple effect they're going to have, right? Both parties have a ripple effect on the other, right? And so forth. Again, I don't care. I'm not talking about politics here. I'm talking about that's an illustration of ignoring in that case, the noise or the way things might seem in a certain sense. Same thing with business relationships. I basically ignore how great or how lame someone might seem. I for the most part, ignore it. A lot of people pride themselves on how much information they can get from a small initial interaction with someone. I'll pride myself on basically ignoring that and setting up a project that we can work on together. If it obviously I don't do that with every single person on earth, but if it comes up and there's other reasons why it's relevant, then I'll mostly ignore that. And there's evidence that people should be hiring people that hire for jobs should pretty much ignore an interview, like it's basically counterproductive and misleading if anything. And they should look at other factors and stuff. So it's actually a thing to ignore what seems like where you could pride yourself on making quick judgments, and instead look at the overall frame or box or look from there. So that's what I'm talking about today. And of course, I talk about priorities, right? How do I look to accomplish things in my life? I pretty much exclusively look to make it a priority for real, not just declare it's a priority, but through eliminating other things in my life or finishing them off, through immersion, through eliminating things, triggers for other things, through discovering more, giving it time and seeing more pain from not having something taken care of in my life, whatever it might be, where it gets to be both revealed intellectually and integrated in my mind as a priority, right? That's the kind of the basic box for accomplishing a particular task. And then, of course, I have some other basic ideas about how I make something plan A, have the understanding line. But I pay attention to the overall box and then let the success flow from there. Of course, then the point of the box is then you can just actually see details. But a lot of that is flow at that point. And when you're in flow, it's a different sort of it's a different sort of thing. You're doing a lot less than you think you're doing. And the overall box that you're around your flow is what's really dictating your results at that point. Cool. Okay, I'll see you guys next week. Thanks you very much for terrific again. Very appreciative. Take care. All.